David, wake up. Wake up, David.
Sorry about that. That was a weird intro. I just figured that, statistically speaking, there's probably going to be at least one person who sees this video named David. And so, wanted to give someone a heart attack, I guess. So lately, it seems like there have been a lot of remakes. Like all the Resident Evil games are being remade. Silent Hill is being remade. Dead Space has gotten remade. They just remade System Shock. They remade the first Last of Us game. And all in all, it just kind of feels like a trend right now to, you know, to remake your game from 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. Remake it and put it out and people will eat it up. And so I guess I just wanted to talk about that and take a look at that and really think about whether or not it's a good thing to remake games like this. I'm not trying to make it sound like there are only games that are remakes coming out, because there's not. There are plenty of new and fresh titles. And I'm not trying to make it sound like remakes are bad. I'm not trying to make it sound like these games are bad, because they're not. A lot of them are actually excellent. A lot of these remakes actually seem to surpass the original, which is crazy, because a lot of these games that are getting remakes are just absolutely stellar titles. And so to see them surpassed is kind of incredible. But mostly I just wanted to think about remakes and think about where all of this is heading. Basically, what happens if we continue down this road where we're just remaking everything. So before we really get rolling, I wanted to dive into some definitions. There are a lot of words that I've heard that are used interchangeably, you know, such as reboot, remaster, remake. All these words they have re at the start, but they're all different things. And so I just wanted to make that clear and make it clear what I'm actually talking about. A reboot is whenever you just throw everything out the window and then you say, this is what we're doing from now on. A reboot is often an attempt at reintroducing the audience to this world or these characters or whatever, this gameplay, something like that. A remaster is when you take an older game or older movie or album or whatever, and you just kind of upscale it a little bit. You just make it a little bit better. You fine tune it a little bit. So I haven't seen it so much recently, but I remember that during the 360 PS3 era, there were all these HD remasters of games coming out. Because whenever games were coming out for the PS2, they were made for TVs that had a 4:3 aspect ratio. But after that, the 16:9 aspect ratio became the standard. But basically it's just widescreen. That's what it is we went from square screen to widescreen. So essentially all an HD remaster is you would take Jak and Daxter, it's like a square, and then you go whoop, whoop. You would just add the extra missing pieces. Essentially, you would expand the camera a little bit to include the parts that would have been cut off by older TVs. And also, you would upscale the graphics a little bit. You wouldn't create new models or anything, but you would kind of fine-tune the graphics so that way they looked nicer on modern televisions. Okay, so a reboot, remaster, a sequel is just a second game, second movie, whatever. It's the thing that came out after the original, whatever, that's a completely different thing. Hopefully no one gets these confused. And then finally we come to remakes, which are building the game or the movie or the whatever from the ground up. Basically you're taking the old thing and you're kind of harvesting it for parts, but on the whole, a remake is just something new. It's something new. Or at the very least, one way to determine if something is a remaster or a remake is to ask the question, are they making new models for it? Because if they are making new models for it, it's probably a remake. Because a remaster is just taking the old models and upscaling them a little bit. Meanwhile, a remake is, again, they're building the game from the ground up. As always, these are my definitions, but feel free to comment down below if you have better definitions. Okay, so people have some different philosophies about remakes, so I have to ask the question, what is a remake supposed to be? So there are 4 different philosophies I can think of. And I'm going to talk about the 4 different takes, going from most faithful to least faithful. So the first take is the super faithful remake. So a great example of this is the System Shock remake that came out this year, I think, 2023. This is the current year, not 2033. I'm not a time traveler. I haven't played the original, so I can't speak to it firsthand, but every review that I read about it says that, oh yeah, this is just the original game, just with nicer graphics, essentially. Like they remade it from the ground up, but it sounds like they kept all the levels and, you know, weapons and all that stuff the same. On the whole, System Shock seems to be a super faithful remake to me, and I think that even bleeds through for me, you know, just someone who hasn't played the original. Like, it's kind of clear to me that it's super faithful, because there are certain aspects of the game that feel dated. And I'm playing through it right now and I'm really loving it, but there are certain things such as the lack of objective markers, you know, that just make the game feel kind of old. It makes it feel like it could have been streamlined a little bit more, just because it's like I will log back into the game and I'll be like, what was I doing? And then I'll just run around for a bit and it's fine, I figure it out. But it doesn't have those modern conveniences that we take for granted. because it is faithful. Okay, the second philosophy about remakes is the very faithful category. Okay, so very faithful with additions. Examples of this include the Resident Evil 1 remake and the Dead Space 1 remake. Both of these games are very faithful to their respective original games, but at the same time, they're not afraid to just add crap in. They're not afraid to add plot lines and new areas and just new sections to the level. The Resident Evil 1 remake added an entirely new mechanic, such as having to burn zombies' bodies so that way they don't come back as Crimson Heads. The Dead Space remake added entirely new things such as side quests, which were not a thing at all in the original game. In both games, they really beefed up the story. Like, they kept the same story that was already there, but they beefed it up tremendously. But even though these games have a lot of new additions, at their core, they're still the original game, I think. So for instance, I just played through the Dead Space remake, and there are a bunch of new areas that are just new. There are also areas that feel like they were just straight up ripped out of the old game. Like areas that felt like they were just straight up ripped out of Dead Space 1 and just put into the new game with slightly better graphics or whatever. And so I think both of these games are very faithful to the original, but at the same time, they're not afraid to experiment and be a little bit unfaithful. And they're the better for it. The third philosophy about remakes is to keep the core ideas intact, the basic ideas intact, but to do something completely different with the game. So I think examples of this philosophy include the Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 remakes. Both of those games kind of keep a lot of the same ideas of the original games, but at the same time, I've played both remakes enough, and I've played both of the original games enough to know that the remakes and the originals are very different from one another. You know, in all four games, in the two remakes and the two originals, you play as Leon, but that character is very different across those four games. If you look at the two different versions of Resident Evil 4, then that comes across very clearly. Because in the original game, Leon makes a lot of goofy jokes and puns and whatever, and he does so in the remake, but there's a kind of cynicism about the new Leon. There's a kind of unhappiness that was not there in the original game. And I think that's a good representation of kind of how the game changed as a whole, because the remake took basically all the main ideas of the original game. Almost every boss is here. There's like one that I can think of that was cut. Almost every area found in the original Resident Evil 4 is found here in the remake. Like the Dead Space and Resident Evil 1 remakes, there are massive additions. And like those games, there are a few areas in the Resident Evil 4 remake that I can think of that just felt like they were ripped straight from the original game. So for instance, the early bingo scene, I guess, in the town with the chainsaw, that town setup is the exact same as the original game. But on the whole, to me, whenever I play that game, it feels like there's more new stuff than there is old stuff. And I'm sure that someone could go through and kind of mathematically calculate it, but it feels to me like there were more areas that were just completely redesigned or entirely new additions than there were areas that were just plucked straight from the original and put into this new game. So that was category number 3, with the core ideas attacked, but overall, very different execution. And then we have the fourth category, and I was not sure if I wanted to talk about this, but we're gonna go ahead and do it. Category number 4 is the complete reimagining. So Silent Hill Shattered Memories is an example of this. This is a weird game to categorize because I think you could call it a reboot because it is so different from the other Silent Hill titles, and it doesn't really reset the timeline so much as just kind of make its own timeline, I guess. You know, it never erased the original games or anything like that. But at the same time, it still is a remake of that first game. It still is based around that same exact plot thread of Harry Mason trying to find his daughter. And he goes through Silent Hill and he has to meet weird people and he has to figure out where his daughter is and, you know, whatever. But in Shattered Memories, everything is covered in ice and it's not the bloody, rusty grossness of the first game. So Shattered Memories is basically its own thing, but at the same time, it is a remake of 1 because it's the same story, same characters, whatever. It's a completely different approach to it, and so that's why I debated as to whether or not I should even include this, but I said screw it, and so we're talking about it now. So yeah, that's category number 4, the complete reimagining, where you leave only the most integral parts there, and you just completely redo the rest. So yeah, 4 categories. 4 categories of faithfulness. When you come home late at night, and your partner asks you which category of faithfulness you've been, don't say number 4, don't say number 3, don't say number 2, unless it's true. That rhymed. Okay, so now that we've established what a remake is, we have to ask the question, why would you remake something? There are like 3 reasons I came up with. Sorry, 4. 4 reasons. 4 categories of faithfulness. Okay, so first reason, why would you remake something? Money. 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 Money is the reason why. There's a book I read for a screenwriting course, which was the worst course I've ever taken, but it was written by a guy named Blake Snyder, and the book is called Save the Cat. And basically it's kind of just a screenwriting 101 book. It kind of sucks because there's some really good info in the book, but at the same time, Blake Snyder just comes off like a pompous jerk. I really didn't care for him as a narrator. But like I said, some good information. So there's one point where he talks about why you see sequels and remakes and reboots and why you see stuff that's familiar, why it seems like Hollywood has no new ideas. And I think the phrase he uses to explain why these things exist is that there is a built-in audience for them. Whenever a studio is trying to decide what to greenlight, they look at how much money they think they can make. And these producers like to play it safe because this is money we're talking about. So they don't want to lose their house or whatever the frick, I don't know. They don't want to lose their $1 million gold yacht or whatever. So the reason you see so many remakes and sequels and reboots and whatever else is because there's a built-in audience for these things. So for instance, Spider-Man. Everyone knows Spider-Man. Everyone has enjoyed Spider-Man's movies. Even if you don't like Spider-Man, then you know who Spider-Man is. So if I tell you, hey, if there's a new Spider-Man movie coming out, you're going to be interested. If you've enjoyed Spider-Man's movies in the past, then you might be looking forward to this new one. But basically, you see, I don't have to sell you on it. I don't have to convince you, hey man, you should go see this new Spider-Man movie. It's about a guy, he gets bit by a radioactive spider and he has powers, and then his uncle dies and it's very sad. I don't have to sell you on any of that bullcrap. I just go, hey, Spider-Man, and then you go, cool. So basically, there's a market that exists for remakes that is not there for brand new things, because if it's something new, then that's when I have to start convincing you, and I'm like, yeah, so there's this new movie and, you know, it looks kind of cool, you know, and there's a general cynicism around new stuff just because it's like, oh, it's probably gonna suck. And you're right, it probably will suck, quite frankly. A lot of new things suck, and we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, reason number one why you remake something: money. Just the audience is there, so you don't have to worry as much about money, and you can spend more money on like a new Resident Evil game just because you can justify it, because you know that people are going to buy it. And especially if it's a remake, especially if you're remaking something that is already beloved by so many people. The Last of Us is already considered one of the greatest games of all time, so they're like, yeah, let's go ahead and remake it. We can just make a little bit more money doing it. And even if you're not a fan of something that already exists, you've probably heard of it. Right, if something's been around for a long time and, you know, you've been meaning to get into it, a remake can serve as the perfect entry point into a series. So, for instance, I had never played System Shock 1, and then it got remade, and then here I am now, and I'm playing it, and I'm having a great time. And it wasn't a series I was completely unfamiliar with, because I'd played about 5 hours of the second game, but still, it was a game series that I had heard a lot about before I actually sat down and started playing it. Literally, the reason why I bought System Shock is because my cousin was like, hey, have you played the System Shock remake? And I'm like, no. And he's like, it's awesome, you should play it. And I'm like, cool, I like BioShock, which is a spiritual successor to System Shock. If you didn't know that, because they're both about shocks. The Shocker is also the third game of the series. Very confusing that they did that. You know, they went game, fictional character. It doesn't make any sense. So money is the first reason why you would remake something. The second reason why is safety. It's to be safe. So if you remake something, you're safe because you know that the money is going to be coming in. But also artistically, you're kind of safe because you don't have to take too many risks if you're remaking something. If you're remaking something that's beloved, then you can just look at it and you can be like, okay, it did everything right except for like these 2 things, and we're going to fix these 2 things. And that's it. That's all you have to really think about. And I'm exaggerating a bit, you know, usually there are 3 things that are wrong with something. But regardless, I think the point still stands. It's safe to remake something because you know what people like, and so if you just do that again, they'll like it again. Also, in theory, I think it should be faster to remake something from the ground up, just because it's already figured out, the game's already written and has been made and programmed, and so you have the best blueprint you could possibly hope for. That blueprint being a final copy of what you're trying to make. So it's safe for you as the creator, but it's also safe for the audience. They don't have to risk slapping their money down for something that they may or may not enjoy. And it is one of those things to where you are potentially missing out on something that you would love. But yeah, remakes are just kind of a safe bet all around. The third reason why you would remake something is much less cynical than the other 2. And it is just that I think that I could understand why, if you were an artist and you felt like you could do better than what you had done 10 or 20 years ago, I could see why you might want to revise it and revisit it and try to make it better. I could see why, as an artist, you might want to try to take something that you already made and make it into the best version of the thing that it could be. So in theory, I absolutely see why you might want to do that. You know, take money, take safety away from it, just focus on what you want to do and you making the most out of something. I could see why you might want to remake something. But we're talking about games here which are made by hundreds and hundreds of people, and most of the people who worked on the original games are not working on the remakes. There are exceptions to this, you know, like a lot of the Resident Evil 4 remake staff worked on the original title, but Shinji Mikami, who's the actual game director and creator of Resident Evil, did not work on the title, so it was someone else filling his shoes. And so it's one of those things to where if someone else is filling your shoes, like if you didn't even work on the original, but you're remaking it, then the question comes up, it's like, well, you know, what is the artistic reason why you're wanting to do it? Why are you wanting to copy someone else's work, essentially? Are you wanting to remake it because you think that you could improve the original because you just have that much reverence for the original? Or is it out of pride and because you think you could do even better than this great thing? And it's a question that has to be answered on a kind of case-by-case basis, I guess. And then the fourth reason why you might remake something is just the plain and simple and obvious one, which is that games go out of date very quickly. Games are a weird art form because I think that every kind of art form that involves any kind of technology, you know, whether it be CDs or DVDs or even books, I guess, as a technology, every kind of art form has to deal with the practicalities of people enjoying it. You have to deal with the real practical stuff about how the art is being transmitted and shown to people. So for instance, if you're a filmmaker, then you want to make sure that your film is moved from one medium to the next. So hopefully you weren't a filmmaker whose only films are available on VHS, because if your only films are available on VHS, then your films probably aren't being watched anymore. And it's the same kind of thing with games. You know, if your game is only available for the Super Nintendo, then some people are playing it, but at the same time, if it hasn't been ported to other systems, then it's kind of dead, in a manner of speaking. The art is kind of just not going to go anywhere further than where it's already gone. And yeah, you have collectors, you have people who are willing to dig up, you know, the lost and hidden gems. But at the same time, unless it's accessible, it's never going to achieve any kind of major success, I think. Games go out of date very quickly. And half of that is just that, you know, sometimes systems don't support the format of older games. But then also they go outdated from just a creation standpoint, you know, technology improves, so graphics go out of date very quickly. And then with gameplay, sometimes the gameplay just feels clunky, sometimes it feels messy, sometimes it just doesn't feel refined in any real kind of way. And so that is why you might want to remake a game. One attitude that's used to kind of justify the remaking of games is just that, oh, you know, the old game is clunky, or it's old, it's unplayable, whatever. And so we have to remake it from the ground up so that way a brand new audience can enjoy this game. But the problem I have with that logic is they're not really enjoying that game though. If you're remaking it from the ground up, if you're changing the story, if you're changing the gameplay, if you're changing the structure of the game, the level design, everything about it, it's not the same game. And so I think that's just something that needs to be acknowledged, that you're not going to be able to replicate perfectly the original game because you're not making the original game, you're remaking it. And I think that even though you can do 99% of things better than the original, there's still going to be something that is off about the remake. You're making something new. You're crafting an entirely different experience than the original. Your remake is not going to be the original, and that's literally the entire point of the remake. That is why you're remaking it, is so that way it's different than the original. But at the same time, I think that it must be acknowledged that it's not going to be the same exact experience as playing the original. And sometimes that's a bad thing, oftentimes it's actually a good thing. Because I really do think that is the best thing about remakes is, you know, category number 3 that I was talking about. The artist can go back in and then they can improve their work and make it actually the best thing that that piece can be. I do think that compromises with regards to how art is handled and treated kind of have to be made over time. The artist's wishes aren't always or even usually respected. But to be fair, some people have kind of crazy wishes. So for instance, a lot of film directors have some wishes about how they wish their art to be perceived. So there's an entire video where David Lynch talks about how if you watch one of his movies on your phone, then you didn't actually see the movie. And David Lynch is like, oh, you think you actually saw the movie because you saw it on a phone? Get real. That's how he says it, is he says, get real. I can't do a good David Lynch voice. So David Lynch wants you to be actually watching his movies on a TV or a screen of some sort, a big screen. And that's what I want, is I want you to be watching all my videos on a Jumbotron at a football stadium, but alas, we do not all get our wishes. And this is a weird one, but like Quentin Tarantino has asked that whenever you go to see one of his movies, that you live stream your bare feet while you're watching his movies, so that way he can watch your feet while you're watching his movie. You know, it seems a bit weird to me, but he's like a genius, so like, he gets a pass, I guess. So I have so many mixed feelings about remakes, and so that's why I wanted to make this video, is to just talk about them, because I don't like the premise of a remake. Like, I don't even like the idea of remaking something. And the reason why is because I think that if you spend years of your life on a project and it's the best you can do, that's awesome. Like, that's great. Great work. Great job. You don't need to feel like you need to continue working on it for the next 20 years or whatever. Once you finish something, it's done, you know, mistakes and all. And really, I think you should probably just leave things alone as much as you can. But broadly speaking, I think that it's a bad idea to remake something just because I don't think you're ever going to be able to replicate the original. I don't think that you're going to be able to catch lightning in a bottle again. But however good the remake is, it's not going to be the same thing as the original. And sometimes that's better. Sometimes you don't want it to be the exact same thing as the original. That's the entire point of a remake. But sometimes it's worse. Sometimes you screw up somewhere and you forget what made something great. And so you kind of hurt things a little bit by remaking it. And so in my eyes, if you have a choice between remaking something or making something new, I think it's probably just better to make something new. I think it's probably just better for you as an artist, honestly, to go and make something new as opposed to just meddling with the work that you did however many years ago. So as I was writing notes for this, I was asking myself questions. I was like, would I rather have a remake of Resident Evil 5 or would I rather have Resident Evil 9? And I would rather have Resident Evil 9 100%. I would rather have that game than a remake of 5. But then that got me thinking, and I'm like, well, do you even need sequels, right? Should you even make sequels to things? And honestly, that's a similar topic, but it's still a different video, so I'm not gonna really touch too much on it. But I would rather have something new than something remade. But with that being said, the remakes that have come out recently have been freaking great. Like, some of these remakes have been the best games in their series. The Dead Space 1 remake, I think, is probably the best Dead Space game. The Resident Evil 4 remake, somehow better than the original. And so that's what has me second guess, in my opinion, about remakes, is these games have been great. Like, again, not even just good, not even okay, not even just pretty good. They've been great. And so I think it's dangerous to be beholden to the past. I think it's dangerous to keep on looking back to the past for ideas, because then, you know, things get stale after a while. But again, a lot of these remakes are introducing entirely new mechanics and story elements and ideas to the original games. So they are remaking the game, but at the same time, it's still different than the original. And like I was saying, you can't recreate the original. Whenever you remake something, you're not actually making the same thing. You're doing something different with the same title. And so it feels almost like I'm contradicting myself, because I'm saying that I don't want things to be beholden to the past, but at the same time, these games that are remakes aren't completely beholden to the past, because they are full of new ideas. And so I think that's the problem for me. I think that's why I'm confused, is they are remakes of old games, but they feel new in a lot of ways. Like the Resident Evil 4 remake introduced a freaking parry mechanic. I never thought I would see that in a Resident Evil game, but it's like, yeah, you parry guys now. And it's like, this is awesome. And so I guess that really my concern with remakes is this. I don't think it's sustainable long term. You're gonna run out of crap to remake. And that's what it boils down to for me, I think, is I think that remaking games can be a great way to kind of find your footing. And I think that's exactly what has happened, is Resident Evil kind of lost its way for a few years, and then they decided to make Resident Evil 7, and then they remade Resident Evil 2. And that was really when people started paying attention to Resident Evil again. Dead Space. Dead Space was dead for freaking 10 years. Then they remake the first game, and they're like, oh yeah, this is why people like the series. Silent Hill, same thing. Silent Hill as a series has been dead for like 10 years. They're remaking the second game now, because that's the one people like. So I think that for a lot of these companies, remakes have been used as a starting point. I think that they've been using them as a starting point to try to kind of go, this is what we're trying to do with this series. Still, I think you have to be pressing forward into new directions, and I think you have to keep on trying to move forward. I don't think that you can just be remaking crap all the time. And I think that's what Resident Evil is doing. I think that's what Silent Hill is doing. Because both of these series, yeah, they have their remakes, but they also have entirely new games coming out. So for instance, Silent Hill has the Silent Hill 2 remake coming out, and if that's not good, then maybe one of the newer games will be good. And so I think some of these series are kind of pushing forward into new directions. I think they are trying to figure out where the boundaries are with what they can and can't do. And that's exciting and that's awesome, and I love that. But then if you look at Dead Space, for instance, there are two moves for Dead Space, right? Because there were only 3 mainline Dead Space games. There was Dead Space 1, there was Dead Space 2, there was Dead Space 3. So with Dead Space, they remade Dead Space 1. So their two options are remake Dead Space 2 or make Dead Space 4. That's it. Or even if you don't want to call it Dead Space 4, call it a Dead Space spin-off game or something like that. That would be cool. And honestly, I think they're going to remake Dead Space 2. I don't see a Dead Space 4 coming anytime soon. But then if that's what they're doing, if they're remaking Dead Space 2, then they're probably going to end up remaking Dead Space 3. And it's like, okay, cool. So this is now a series that is composed of the same amount of remakes as it is original games. And it's like, that's not a good place to be. And if you look at The Last of Us, they just remade the first game. There are 2 Last of Us games. There's part 1, there's part 2. They remade part 1. And so now all that they can do is they can either remake part 2 or they can make part 3. And so I think that remakes can be cool as long as you are doing something else in the meantime. I think that as long as you are doing things that are not just remaking games, then I think that you'll probably end up in a good place. But if all you're doing is remaking stuff, then I don't see how that's sustainable long term. Because sooner or later, you're going to have to start making something new. It's an evolve or die type situation. You will run out of stuff to remake, and so sooner or later, you're either going to have to make something new, or you're going to have to die again. And I'm talking about series, I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about like Dead Space. I'm talking about like Dead Space dying for a second time. But after all this, maybe I'm just thinking too far ahead into the future. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe remakes don't need to be sustainable. Maybe they just are a way to generate interest in the series and to kind of renew it and make it feel alive again. But I mean, I guess at the end of the day, the remakes are great. Not just good, they're great. So, I'll keep enjoying them in spite of my concern. So, if you have any thoughts about remakes or anything, feel free to drop a comment. Thank you for watching and have a nice night. See ya. Wake up, David. David, wake up.